It is great to welcome Tevi Troy to this podcast. He is a presidential historian and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we're here to discuss the legendary columnist William Safire, whom Tevi wrote a wonderful tribute to in City Journal. The piece is titled The Must Read Columnist, Remembering the Career of William Safire. Tevi, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about William Safire, who was a great influence on me as I was young, and I'm a big fan.
Okay. So, Sapphire is, of course, served in the Nixon administration, and this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Watergate scandal. So, as a presidential historian, how should we remember the Nixon administration?
Well, the Nixon administration was an administration that began with great promise and was actually successful in its first term, had a huge historic win in its attempt for a second term. And almost as soon as Nixon was inaugurated, he was started to get weighed down by the Watergate scandal. And by the summer of 1974, the 50th anniversary of his resignation, he was out and disgraced because of the burglary and the attempt to cover it up. So a scandal that I think destroyed an administration of great progress, of great promise.
Yes, and we should also mention, given the escalating tensions in the Middle East, that the Nixon administration was very significant in fostering U.S. ties with Israel in the wake of the 73 Yom Kippur War, I'd say.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of interesting points about that. First of all, Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor and then also Secretary of State, the only person to hold both roles simultaneously, he maneuvered a successful conclusion to that war that laid the ground, set the groundwork for a 50-year peace with Egypt that still holds to today, but also forced the Soviets out of the Middle East. And they were a nefarious actor and they were causing a lot of trouble there. Now the Russians, 50 years later, are back in the Middle East and once again causing trouble. But the Nixon administration, especially under Kissinger's leadership, did a great job in getting rid of the Soviets from the Middle East. The second thing to think about in that is you mentioned the ties with Israel. The U.S. has had political ties with Israel since its beginning, but the national security establishment of the U.S. was very skeptical of Israel for its first 25 years. After Israel's success in the Yom Kippur War, which initially, kind of like October 7th, Israel suffered a terrible surprise defeat, a lot of soldiers killed, but Israel turned it around and not only defeated the Syrians and the Egyptians, but they also captured a lot of Soviet weaponry. And they showed that weaponry to U.S. Defense Department analysts. And it was the first time that the U.S. had gotten to see the insides of the Soviet tanks, for example. And that was a huge coup for American military intelligence. And so suddenly the defense establishment recognized that there was a benefit to being allied with Israel, not just a cost.
Yes, another great triumph of the Nixon administration is that we, as in the human race, got to land a man on the moon. Technically, the Americans did it, but still, as
Mm.
Armstrong said, it was a triumph for mankind. Uh,
Absolutely.
so there was a speech that Sapphire written that was fortunately not delivered. It was titled "In the Event of the Moon Disaster." So tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So first of all, I don't think Nixon gets enough credit for being the president when the U.S. landed a man on the moon. It's usually talked about a Kennedy triumph, and Kennedy did make the promise that we would have men on the moon within a decade, but Nixon was the president when it happened. But because of Watergate and other reasons, I mean, Nixon was not popular with the mainstream media, is another factor. But Nixon, I don't think gets enough credit for it. And look, I think the it's a real interesting contrast between the Safire speech that was written but not given, and then the Reagan speech on the Challenger that wasn't written until the day it happened, and then it was given. Between 69 and 86, when the Challenger was destroyed, there was this sense suddenly that the U.S. space program was such a uh, safe thing that you didn't even have to write remarks about assuming the Challenger was going to be destroyed. Whereas in 69, we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if the lunar module would blow up, if the men would ever get off the moon. And so they had to prepare for the worst. And Sapphire had a very good way of writing a clear writing style, and I think that was why he was chosen to prepare those remarks.
Of course, the Apollo 13 program was almost a failure, right? Was did it not stick almost failed to stick the landing? Jim Lovell and everyone got to the moon all right, but then they had trouble going back to Earth.
Yeah, of course. And this is a very hard thing to do is to land a man on the moon. And when you think about it, this device I have here in my hand, my iPhone, has more computing power than the entire lunar system had back then. So we've made a lot of progress, but they were kind of doing it with duct tapes and nuts and bolts, and it's really a miracle that they were as successful as they were with that space program.
So, was Bill Safire implicated in any way with Watergate?
Now, that's a really good question. He was not, and he got out before the Watergate scandal exploded, and he was not involved in the cover-up in any way. And I think at the time he may have felt like he wasn't on the in enough to be aware of it. But in retrospect, it was a good thing for him. He got out. He wanted to be a New York Times columnist, and that's what he got to be. He had some bumps along the road to get there, but he had nothing to do with with the Watergate scandal. And it's interesting that he names his memoir Before the Fall, which suggests that this is when he was working for Nixon before the fall. He was there at the apex.
Tell me about the relationship that Bill Safire had with another great Nixon speechwriter, Patrick J. Buchanan. You had a wonderful anecdote in your tribute piece, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, Buchanan's a little younger than Sapphire, maybe a little more pugnacious, definitely more conservative. And Sapphire is more of an old Washington hand, knows Nixon for longer. He knows him since the so-called kitchen debate with Khrushchev in the 50s. That's where he first meets Nixon. He's also a veteran of the 1960 campaign. So in 69, this relatively fresh speechwriter, Buchanan, is there, and Sapphire kind of is showing him the ropes, but also, these speechwriters, there's often friendly rivalries or frenemies, I guess. And after Buchanan writes some well-regarded remarks that Nixon gives at the Air Force Academy in Colorado, Sapphire says, "Oh, just be gracious, take the win, don't take credit for the speech, because that's not what speechwriters do." And then Buchanan goes along with this idea of Sapphire's. It sounds very modest and gracious. And then he reads in National Review that Sapphire was the author of the remarks, which of course Sapphire was not. He just knew that Buchanan wasn't going to take credit, so he stepped into the void that he himself created. So I'm sorry, Buchanan said that he kind of woke up after that and realized that that's how the game is played. The
So,
truth is that Buchanan got played, but he learned from his experience, and Buchanan was actually pretty good at pushing back against Henry Kissinger, who was a very savvy and sharp-elbowed bureaucratic player himself. There are these stories that Kissinger would hold up papers by saying the National Security Council has to review them before they can go to the president. And so what Buchanan would do is he would stay up all night writing the thing until the moment it was due. And then he'd say it has to go to the president, and he would prevent Kissinger from holding it up and then rewriting it in the way Kissinger wanted.
right. So you mentioned that Sapphire was an observant Jew, and tell me about the his interactions with the fellow Jew in the White House, Henry A. Kissinger.
Yeah, they were friendly, and maybe their their Jewishness had something to do with it. I wouldn't call Sapphire an observant Jew. He did go to Yom Kippur services, and when he told Nixon that he was going, Nixon was kind of marveled at it and said, "You really do all that with the cap and the shawl and everything? Good for you." And of course, Sapphire later became known for hosting a break fast after Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a 25-hour fast, and Jews get together to break the fast afterwards. And Sapphire's break fast was legendary and had all the kind of key Washington players and movers. You knew you had made it if you were invited to the Sapphire break fast. So Yom Kippur had a lot of interesting connections for Sapphire. The other Yom Kippur story is that Sapphire was close to Spiro Agnew and would travel with Agnew. And during the 1970 midterm campaign, he was traveling out west with Agnew, and he flew back to Washington to make it for the Yom Kippur services at his synagogue, which is Adas Israel on Connecticut Avenue. It still stands today. And Safire had been known for writing some of the hardest hitting speeches that Agnew gave on the campaign trail and elsewhere. And he would have these famous alliterative phrases like the nattering nabobs of negativism. And when Sapphire gets to the synagogue, after quite of a Herculean task of having to leave, traveling with the vice president, traveling cross country, he gets to the synagogue, and the rabbi, in his remarks, attacks those who use alliteration to divide us. So he was basically attacking Sapphire's speeches. And Sapphire had this great line in his memoir. He said, "This was not the sin I had come to atone for," because Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. And and he talked about how Yitzhak Rabin, who was later prime minister of Israel, but at the time was Israel's ambassador to the U.S., uh, kind of was sympathetic to Sapphire in that uncomfortable moment.
Yes. And of course, Vice President Agnew was probably one of the many scandals in the Nixon White House. He resigned, I believe, in 1973 due to corruption scandals. So, how should we remember the legacy of Vice President Agnew?
Yeah, let's back up. I mean, it's true that there was the Watergate scandal, and it's true that Agnew had to resign. But I wouldn't say there's so many scandals in the Nixon White House. There were two. They were pretty big ones. And the Agnew one was for things he had done before he ever came to the White House. He'd basically taken bribes and kickbacks as governor of Maryland, including, paper bags filled with cash. I mean, it was pretty bad stuff. But I guess people didn't know about it when he was vetted for the job as vice president. Agnew uh, was kind of one of these urban ethnic types. He was of Greek descent, and those those ethnic types had generally been part of the Democratic coalition, and they were unhappy with the leftward drift of the Democratic Party, and so they were kind of they later were known as Reagan Democrats. This was 10 years before Reagan was president, but they became known as Reagan Democrats, and Agnew was kind of a preview of what was to come on that front, and he was very hard hitting on the campaign trail, and Nixon liked his pugnaciousness, and that's why he picked him as vice president. He wasn't that much of a big player in the Nixon White House. He wasn't much of a policy person. He did get involved in the political stuff, and Nixon liked his speeches, especially when Sapphire was writing them. But yeah, he had this embarrassing incident, and I think what happened was he agreed to resign the vice presidency, in exchange for not being prosecuted, and he didn't have to go to jail for the bribery scandal. But the interesting thing about Agnew's departure is it happens in the midst of the Watergate scandal, and at this point, the scandal is bad enough that people know that there's a chance Nixon may not survive. So there's a real question about who's going to be Nixon's vice president because in this case, Nixon's vice president has a really good shot of becoming president. Now, there's a bunch of complications here. From Nixon's perspective, he thought he was going to pick someone who would never be, I guess, sold as president so that it would be an insurance policy that they wouldn't get rid of Nixon because they wouldn't want the vice president to take over. But the other factor, and this is, I think, more important, is they needed someone who could get through congressional confirmation, especially through the House. And the Democrats controlled the House, and it would be very hard to get a standard Republican, certainly a Nixon favored Republican. So they went with Jerry Ford, who is the House Minority Leader and was shown as someone who could get along with the Democrats and wasn't seen as too radical, not too right wing. And so he was a safe pick to get through the confirmation process. And then Nixon, I guess, miscalculated because Ford was a perfectly fine person to step in, especially as the Watergate scandal got much worse and people realized that, maybe we don't want this Nixon guy around anymore.
Yes. It's very interesting because Gerald Ford might be the only president in American history who was not elected in any way, shape, or form. And in his 2 or so years in office, he might be most remembered for being the man who pardoned President Nixon. But other than that, how should we remember it? I believe the 36, 37 president of the United States, Gerald Ford.
Yeah, no, it's a good point about Ford, and you're totally right. He was never elected to anything by the voters other than his congressional district in Michigan. And I say by the voters because he was also elected as House Minority Leader, so his congressional colleagues did elect him to that. But this was something that stuck with him and really drove him crazy. People would always say, "Oh, well, Ford, who became vice president without ever having been elected to anything beyond his district in Michigan," and then when he's on the campaign trail in 1976 running against Reagan for the Republican National the Republican nomination, he wins some primaries and then he says, well, maybe this will shut up the people who say that I've never been elected to anything by anyone outside my congressional district. So Ford was obviously sensitive on that part. He was actually sensitive on a lot of things. He didn't like the fact that they made fun of his klutziness. And he was actually a superior athlete. He was drafted by the NFL. He was a top player in the University of Michigan team in the 1930s. So he was a great athlete. There were a couple of, when you're president, you're always being filmed. And there were a couple of unfortunate incidents where he slipped, and they weren't even really his fault. But anyway, he slipped, and there was this reputation that he was a klutz or a clumsy guy. And this was picked up by Saturday Night Live, where Chevy Chase, and this is in Saturday Night Live's very early days, Chevy Chase would play Gerald Ford. And now today, when you have someone play Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, they get the makeup and the hair and the dress exactly right, so you know who it is when you say, "Oh, that guy's obviously dressed up to look like Trump." But in those days, Chevy Chase was just sitting there in an office. It wasn't even look completely like the Oval Office, but it looked like an official office, and he would stumble around and he would trip. And people knew by the fact that he was stumbling around that he was supposed to be Jerry Ford. And so it was a particularly cruel portrait of Ford. And so Ford is known for the klutziness, for the pardoning of Nixon, for taking over, but also for blowing his election in the debates against Jimmy Carter when he wrongly said there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and stuck with it. What he was trying to say is that in their hearts, the people of Eastern Europe don't feel like the Soviet Union is their legitimate government, but that's not how it sounded. And he had opportunities to walk back the statement, and he stuck with his guns. And it was basically a mistake, and I think it may have cost him a very, very close election to Jimmy Carter in '76.
And of course, he was the first US president to have the so-called honor of being lampooned by Saturday Night Live.
Well, I mean, yes, but to be fair, Saturday Night Live started in his administration, so it's not like they could have lampooned Kennedy or Johnson. They just they weren't around for it at the time. Although the mores changed, and when people uh, talked about making fun of Kennedy or Johnson in the '60s, the network censors would prevent it. They say you can't make fun of the president. But then by the '70s, the attitudes of the American people, and in part because of the Watergate scandal, things had changed, and it seemed okay to make fun of the president in that way.
So back to Safire. Tell me about his conservative views, especially when compared to, say, Patrick Buchanan and others.
Yeah, I mean, Safire was seen as a moderate Republican. He in the '64 convention when they nominated Barry Goldwater, he would hold up a sign saying "Stay in the mainstream." So I mean, he was more of a middle of the road Republican. Buchanan was kind of more of a conservative fire breather. And Nixon used that in the White House. He had different roles for his different speechwriters. Usually, when he wanted some hard-hitting conservative point to be made, he went with Buchanan. And then when he wanted elevated language, he would go with Ray Price. And then when he wanted something complex explained, he would go with Safire. So each speechwriter had a separate role. But yeah, I would say um, Safire was generally a moderate Republican, but I mean, he supported Ronald Reagan pretty strongly throughout Reagan's presidency. He was a hawk on the Cold War. He was very pro-Israel. So there are a lot of areas in which he was also conservative. I would just say domestically, he might have been a little more to the left of some of the more right-wing figures in the Nixon White House.
Yes. Sapphire wrote a book titled Lend Me Your Ears, so a reference to Julius Caesar, in which he outlined some of the great speeches in history. So, according to Sapphire, what makes a good political speech?
Well, clarity above all. I mean, you just have to be clear in what you're saying. use of there's rhetorical techniques that Sapphire was an expert in. So having some kind of soaring rhetoric that gets people interested and excited, and humor. Sapphire was a believer in humor, wordplay. So I mean, he took his writing very seriously, and he knew having been there, he knew what made a great political speech.
Yes, and you mentioned Safire being committed pro-Israel commentator slash writer. So in the time that Safire, well, after he left the White House and when he was writing his column, how has the relationship between the United States and Israel changed?
Yeah, so as I said, the national security establishment was a little slow to come around to be in favor of Israel, though they eventually did, in part because of that 73 Yom Kippur War. In the first 25 years of Israel's existence, I would say that the Democrats were seen as the pro-Israel party, and it was kind of a liberal position to be for this liberal democracy among a sea of autocracies in the Middle East, which it still is. It still is a liberal democracy amongst a sea of autocracies. It's just that the world of liberalism has changed, where they side with oppressors rather, where they have this whole idea about oppressors versus oppressed, and they wrongly see Israel as the oppressor. So Israel, I think, gets a lot of flack for that, but they fail to see that Israel is a democracy and it's still in a sea of autocracies, very cruel autocracies. I mean, the Iranians are constantly hanging their political opponents. There's no democratic elections that mean anything in any country in the Middle East other than in Israel. Uh, that's one thing. But then what happened was the Republicans, starting with Reagan, I would say, but then increasing in the 90s with the Republican Congress, Newt Gingrich in particular, the Republicans started becoming more pro-Israel. So I would say by the 1990s, we had what we called the bipartisan consensus, where both parties were pretty pro-Israel. But then starting in the 2000s or so, the Democratic Party starts to drift away from Israel. And Barack Obama has this, I think, ridiculous theory that we want to prop up the Iranians to make them a counterbalance to the Sunnis and Israel. When, the Sunnis in the Saudi Arabia and Israel are our allies, and Iran is an avowed enemy of the U.S. So I just don't understand the theory, but that is what they're trying to pursue. And so now I would say it's pretty clear that the Republican Party is the more pro-Israel party, and Israel has a lot to worry about from the Democratic administrations, including a lot of people who serve in the Biden administration who don't have Israel's best interest at heart. And you can see the leak of Israel's plans for hitting back at Iran came from within the Biden administration. Now, I wouldn't say that applies to Biden himself, uh, but he himself has said to Bibi Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, he said, uh, "Look, this is not Scoop Jackson's Democratic Party anymore." Now, Scoop Jackson was a Democratic senator from Washington State who was very anti-Soviet, very pro-Israel. And he made sure that the Democratic Party kind of stayed in line on the pro-Israel position for a long time. But he's been gone for 40 years. And so the Democratic Party, as Biden correctly noted, is no longer Scoop Jackson's Democratic Party.
Yes. And I did an entire episode of this podcast about the great Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State. So he was a remarkable man and should be a greater influence to the current Democratic Party.
Amen to that. I used to work for Ben Wattenberg, who
Mhm.
was a Scoop Jackson aide and a huge fan of Scoop. And but by the time I worked for Wattenberg, Scoop was already dead, but he was always telling me great Scoop Jackson stories, including I'll tell you one, since you're a Scoop Jackson fan.
Why
He
not?
said he was traveling in Washington State with Scoop, and they were near some kind of paper mill or industrial mill. And Ben said, "Oh, what is that smell?" And Scoop said, "Don't ever make fun of that smell, Ben. That's the smell of jobs."
Mm, wow, incredible. Yeah. So I'm sure, I think technically speaking, the two parties, Republican and Democratic, are pro-Israel. But of course, there are elements within the two parties that are not pro-Israel at all. And I suppose to an extent, today, the the anti-Israel Democrats are gaining advantage. But there was a time when there were significant Republicans who were anti-Israel. Thinking about, I think James A. Baker was one of them, and certainly Pat Buchanan was one of them. I think William Buckley wrote a book, In Search of Anti-Semitism, criticizing Buchanan and another National
And Joe
Review
Sobran.
colleague, right?
Joe
Joe
Sobran.
Sobran, for their views on Israel. So, did Safire had to what extent did Safire write about, say, his conservative allies who are not on board with Israel?
Yeah, he was a critic of Buchanan, but also a friend of his from the White House. I would say that there were kind of two stages. I think in that period that I first described from 48 to the mid 70s, when the Republican position was to be critical of Israel, which is the Republican Party was not pro-Israel. The later stage that you're talking about with Buchanan and Sobran is in a period where the Republican Party had started to become the pro-Israel party, or at least more pro-Israel than Democrats, and the Democrats still generally pro-Israel, but the Republicans were more pro-Israel. And then there were outliers, and Sobran and Buchanan, I would say, were among the outliers. And I think that is what's going on now. James A. Baker, uh, he's a sort of a slightly different story. He was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State. And they were trying to move towards some kind of peace deal in the Middle East, always trying to find the elusive peace deal in the Middle East. And he was critical of Israel within the administration. I wouldn't call him anti-Israel, but I would say that he was trying to get Israel to make more concessions than Israel thought prudent to make. And the issue of the Jewish vote came up. And Baker said, um, I'm not going to use the word because it's a nice family podcast, but he said, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway, which is a very vulgar and dismissive way of speaking about a proud American constituency. And this gets leaked by uh, Jack Kemp, who is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Bush administration. He leaks it to Ed Koch. And Ed Koch at this point is no longer mayor of New York. He is now a columnist of the Daily News, and he writes it in his column. But it becomes a huge story when Safire picks up the story and reports it in the New York Times that Baker said this. And everybody I know who remembers this remembers that it was from Safire's column that they learned about the Baker comment. And so, yeah, Safire was definitely willing to criticize Republicans who were harsher on Israel.
Tell me more about his on language columns, which I have a book of compilations of his right here.
Yeah. Uh, by the way, the title wasn't clear because of the blurring function,
Yep.
but the picture of Sapphire came through.
Right.
So
There it is.
oh, that's much better. Yeah, what a great cover. Uh, so Sapphire starts as a political columnist for the New York Times, but after a while he picks up this additional column called On Language. We talked about his love of wordplay and his speech writing, and this appeared at the front of the Sunday magazine, Sunday New York Times magazine, which at the time was a must-read thing. I don't think it is anymore, but at the time everybody read the Sunday New York Times magazine, and it would look at words and describe their origins, but also how they're used in political context. And I actually have Sapphire's political dictionary on the shelf behind me somewhere, because that was a compilation of all these different words that he had looked at, where they were first used in American politics and what they mean and what they convey. And it was really a great column. And when I wrote my Sapphire column a couple of weeks ago, the one that you reached out to me about, uh, a friend of mine who hosts the website where my articles are housed. The website's tevitroy.org if anybody's interested, but he houses it on a site called Pundicity, Pundicity. And when my Sapphire article came out, the guy who hosts the website, a guy named Grayson Levy, he sent me a clip of a Sapphire article from the I guess, early 2000s, where he described the use of the word pundit, where the word came from, and how pundit has been used in different types of things. Like people talk about the punditocracy. Uh, but one of the things was he picked up that my friend Grayson Levy had started a site called Pundicity. And so Grayson was very proud that Sapphire had mentioned his site in his on language column because he had mentioned in on language was a really big deal.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. Congratulations. And I believe the term pundit was mostly associated with like Indian spiritual practice, right? Before it became a US thing. It means some sort of teacher or prophet or spiritual advisor.
Right. And now it's just seen as anybody who opines on elections or politics.
Yes. Um, Tell me about the what makes Sapphire a great columnist.
Okay, so there's a great story here. Safire becomes a columnist for the New York Times, and by his own admission, his column stinks. It's not that interesting. People don't like it. It's just this guy opining. And when you are the conservative columnist at the New York Times, you have a higher bar. I mean, so someone like uh, I don't know, Paul Krugman can spout whatever nonsense he's spouting for decades and nobody cares because he spouts liberal nonsense. But if you're the conservative columnist and your column isn't hitting it, it's just not good. And so you just have a more difficult task. And so Sapphire is told by the publisher that they're thinking of dropping his column. He's devastated. All he wants to do is be a New York Times columnist, and he's wondering what he can do. And he's sitting in his office with his head in his hands in despair. And remember, this is the 1970s, and he's got this desk phone. We didn't all have these things back then. You had a desk phone with wires and a dial, and he's staring at the phone in despair, but thinking about the loss of his column. And he has this epiphany. He says, I know a lot of people. I'm going to use this phone to make my column a reported column and make it must read. Maybe didn't think must read at the time, but I'm going to use the phone to reach out to the people I know to write about what's going on. And so it becomes this thing called a reported column, which most columns are not. Most columns are, we talk about pundits. Most columns are just people saying, oh, well, I think this, I think that. I like, Harris, I like Trump, whatever. But he had this reported column where he would talk about what's going on from the minds and the mouths of the top policy players in Washington. And I mentioned Yitzhak Rabin earlier. He was the ambassador to uh, to the U.S. from Israel in the 70s when Safire was in the Nixon White House. By this time later, he becomes a senior player in Israeli politics and becomes prime minister. And he's one of Safire's sources. So Safire would write these columns where he talks about what is Rabin thinking. And so he had world leaders on speed dial. He talked to senior players in the White House. He talked to congressional and Senate leaders. This is one of the reasons why, when Safire's name was bandied about as a possible Secretary of State, he said, "Why would I take the demotion?" Because such a powerful player, he was shaping the way people thought and using his knowledge of everybody in the Washington establishment to do it.
Yes, he reminds me a lot of another great conservative columnist, this time in the Washington Post, the late great Charles Krauthammer, who also had a few run-ins with Rabin, I believe, during the Oslo peace negotiations. That Krauthammer was repeatedly calling Rabin a softie on defense and whatnot. And but nevertheless, he was a brilliant columnist.
He was a brilliant columnist, but they were different. Krauthammer used logic and argument and the force of his words to make people think about his arguments. Whereas Sapphire also was a great writer, but he had this reported column, which I mean, he was bringing in conversations with senior leaders in a way that no other columnist was doing, not even Krauthammer. So it's just a different style of column. And look, every columnist has to find their style. I happen to think it's a very hard thing to do to write a column, to write something compelling, 800 words twice a week for 50 weeks a year. I mean, good luck to you if you can do it, but it's not easy.
Oh yeah, and kudos to I think George Will for doing it. I think he's in his 80s and he's still churning out
Yeah.
a few great pieces a week.
Right, but it's not easy. I mean, George Will, he kind of scours the. I mean, he doesn't really write punditry about the latest development in the newspapers. He scours the conservative magazines and new books, and he'll talk to the authors, and he'll really lay out what their argument is. And so, that's what he's doing in his column these days, and it's interesting, but it's kind of different than what Sapphire was trying to do by breaking news, or Krauthammer was doing by trying to change conventional wisdom through the force of his arguments.
Okay. So finally, tell us a fond memory that you have personally with William Safire.
Well, I only have one. So I grew up in Queens in the 1970s, and there were no conservative sources of information in my house. We got the New York Times. You didn't have the internet. We certainly weren't subscribing to the Wall Street Journal or National Review. And there was just this guy Safire, and I read his stuff, and I always liked it, and it made sense to me, and it was just different from everything else I was reading. And I end up working in the Bush White House in the 2000s, and there's a reception one night, and I see Karl Rove, with whom I worked and I knew, talking to William Safire. And after he's done, I buttonhole Rove and I say, "Wow, Sapphire is such a hero of mine. I would just love to meet him." And so Rove introduces me to Sapphire, and we only spoke for a few minutes, but I got to tell him how much I admired his column and how influential it was for me as a young man in Queens. And he was really interested in that part. Oh, you grew up in New York, you grew up in Queens. And you were reading the paper, and so uh, that was my moment with Sapphire, and it's something I'll always treasure.
Mhm. Yes. And just to mention Karl Rove, I'm actually doing my master's degree on the election of 1896, and Rove
Oh yeah,
wrote
McKinley. So he
a
loves
wonderful book
McKinley.
on, yeah, on McKinley and the election, and I'm relying on that to fund my research and to continue my research and everything.
That's
So,
great. Well, if you're looking at 1896, you should also look at my new book, The Power and the Money, which is a history of presidents and CEOs, and it talks a lot about that era, including McKinley and Roosevelt and Rockefeller. So, Power and the Money, Presidents and CEOs, terrific read.
okay, I'll definitely check that out.
All right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tevi Troy, for joining the program.
Thanks for having me.